William Walker Atkinson's Mind Power. Chapter 22 was a glimpse into the occult world. This is chapter 23, Self-Protection. Now let us return to the consideration of the various forms of the practical operation of telementation. You will, of course, realize that even in the case of mentative influence in personal interviews, there was a passage of mentative currents and a manifestation of telementation. The distance between the two minds is slight, but the principle in operation is precisely the same as when the distance is hundreds of miles, and the process is identical. And you will remember that when I speak of desire force and willpower, I am speaking of the force of the respective two poles of mind power, both of these forms being but phases of the same energy or force. So do not imagine that there are three distinct forces. There is but one force, and that is mind power, of which willpower and desire force, respectively, are but manifestations, the difference depending upon the two respective poles of force, the motive and the emotive, respectively. I trust that you will remember this. I will divide the manifestations of telementation into two general classes, those being, 1, direct telementation, that is, that use of the force with the direct purpose of influencing a certain person or persons, and 2, indirect telementation, that is the use of the force with only a general purpose of effecting the desired result, without special direction toward any particular person or persons. We will now consider these two classes of telementation in their different phases. First, in considering the subject of direct telementation, we see the cases in which personal influence is exerted in personal interviews, and under circumstances in which the mentator and the other person or persons are in close contact, that is, within each other's sight. Under this subclass falls the phenomenon of fascination, personal magnetism, personal influence, persuasion, charming, inducing, and so on, in all of their many and varied phases. We have seen these several manifestations as we have proceeded in these chapters, and we need not stop to further consider them at length in this place. You understand that the effect is caused by the outpouring of the mind power, excuse me, into forms of willpower and desire force, to the end that similar mental states are induced in the minds of others, and the desire or will of the mentator is satisfied to a greater or lesser degree, or completeness according to the circumstances of the case. The second subclass includes those instances of telementation at a long range, which produces the phenomena of mental influencing, will projection, and other forms of influencing, under many names and disguises, including, of course, the employment of the force for the benefit and advantage of the person treated or influenced, as well as the repulsive and deplorable uses alluded to as having been practiced by all people in all times for the purpose of injury to others and selfish profit and advantage to the users. This includes what is known as white magic, or use of the force in an unselfish and justifiable way, and with worthy ends in view, and black magic, or the use of the same force for unworthy ends, and in selfish and unjustifiable ways. But as I have said in the early part of these lessons, this force is like any other great natural force, and is capable of being used for good or for evil, according to the moral state of the user. It is true that the black magician is always entangled in his own web, sooner or later, and falls a victim to the forces he has aroused. But that does not alter the statement that I have made. In this form of telementation, the mentator usually concentrates upon the person or thing that he wishes to affect, and then consciously, and by the use of his will, he sends to that person or thing a current or currents of desire force or willpower, or both, It is known to occultists that the degree of effect so produced depends largely upon the degree of concentration employed by the mentator. The degree of concentration depends upon the will and is manifested in the form of attention. The usual plan is to use the concentrated will to form a clear mental image of the person or thing to be affected, and then to proceed as if one were in the actual presence of the person. The clearer the image, the greater the degree of concentrated will employed, and consequently the greater the degree of the projecting power of the current. Underlying all the phenomena of adverse treatments, witchcraft, and so on is the same form of telementation. But here I wish to say an important word, and that is that the generally claimed effect of these forms of adverse influence is greatly exaggerated, and all real occultists know that the principal reason of the unquestioned effect of this power lies in the mental state of belief, faith, and fear of the persons affected. That is, if one believes or fears that another has the power of adversely influencing or affecting him, then the effect will depend largely upon that degree of faith or fear. The persons who are affected by adverse treatments or witchcraft or similar forms of adverse influence invariably believe and fear that these influences are effective against them. By their mental states, they render themselves negative and receptive to the influences directed against them. This is an occult truth, and one that should be made widely known. It is the antidote to the bane of adverse treatments, of which we hear so much in modern times, as well as in ancient history, under various names. If people would only assert their individual power as centers of power, they would surround themselves with such a positive protective aura that the waves of adverse vibrations would beat against them without ever reaching within their mental structure. We hear of many cases of people being treated in this way in these latter day of pseudo-occultism. We hear of treaters making denials regarding people and thus sending them adverse telementation. These people will assert and work themselves up into a corresponding feeling of, I deny that so-and-so is well, or prosperous, and so on. Some even going so far as to deny that the other person is. You may imagine the effect of currents of this feeling reaching a mind rendered negative by belief and fear that the other person can so affect them. The suggestion of the fear or belief, and that's just what it is, suggestion, renders the mind of such a person a fit receptive agent for the adverse treatment. I tell you, if you will but assert your individuality and assume the fearless attitude, you will be able to laugh in the faces of these adverse practitioners of black magic. For that is just what it is. No matter how much they may try to disguise it by pious names. These modern adverse treatments are nothing less than forms of the old witchcraft which so worried our great-grandfathers, nothing more than the voodoo practices or conjure business that so affrights the poor Negro today. The principles are the same. The practice is the same. And the practitioners are the same at heart. Black-hearted black magicians. All of them. And subject to the same inevitable fate which overtakes all such people, no matter how high their pretenses. The physical and the material agencies used by the voodoo men and the witches of old, the wax images, the pith balls, and all the rest of the tomfoolery, were nothing but the agencies upon which the will of the practitioner could concentrate and aid to concentrated will. Of course, besides, They served to terrify their victims by suggestion. I do not deny that material objects take up and absorb the magnetism of the people, good and bad, for that is all well-established occult truth, and the efficacy of charms, sacred relics, etc. depends upon this fact, together with the aid of suggestion. But I do say that all the charms in the world, all the witchcraft and voodoo material agencies, can produce no other effect than is allowed them by the minds of the persons sought to be affected. Fear and belief determines the degree of receptivity to such influences. The kahuna or prayer man of Hawaii prays people to death, unless they buy him off. But it is the fear and belief on the part of the people that render his work effective. If they would say scat to him mentally, by asserting their individuality as mentative centers, they would be absolutely immune. I need not recount the many instances of this kind of telementation for adverse purposes, for the pages of history are full of them. Although the historians sneer at the whole subject, deeming it a myth and laughing over the credulity of our forefathers, notwithstanding the fact that witches and conjurers went to the scaffold and stake upon confessing their guilt, it is all very well to attribute it all to the imagination of the persons affected. But why do they not tell us a little bit about this strange imagination that produced such real effects upon people? The cause may have been imaginary, but the effects were certainly very real. I will relate to but one instance, which will serve as a type of these forms of telementation. It is cited by an old German physician. He relates that he was consulted by a farmer who complained of being disturbed at night by strange noises which sounded like someone striking iron. The noises occurred between the hours of 10 and 12 every night. The physician asked him if he had any enemy he suspected of thus influencing and annoying him. He replied that there was no one except an old village blacksmith, an old enemy whose power he feared, and who lived several miles from the farmer. The physician bade him return the next day, and in the meantime visited the blacksmith, and asked him, the blacksmith, what he did between the hours of 10 and 12 at night, accompanying the question with a glance of a strong will and power. The blacksmith, now somewhat frightened, replied, I hammer a bar of iron every night at that time, and all the while I think intently of a bad enemy of mine who once cheated me out of some money, and I will at the same time that the noise shall disturb his rest. Well, the physician ordered him to desist, and at the same time made the farmer pay over the money due to the blacksmith. And then there was no more trouble. If you wish further instances of this sort, turn over the pages of any old book which treats upon the witchcraft delusion subject and note the similarity. But one instance is enough to illustrate the matter. They are all cut out of the same cloth. You will note that the two necessary elements present in every case, those being, 1, the use of the force of one person, and 2, the belief or fear or both on the part of the second person. And now you have the whole story. And also, remember, this that I have told you. The same force that is used in such cases for evil purposes may also be used, and is used, for the most beneficial and worthy purposes. The treatments for good things practiced by the practitioners of the various schools of mental science and other New Thought people are along the lines of direct telementation. People have been encouraged, helped, healed, reformed, and otherwise aided and benefited by telementation. Do not lose the recollection of the good in considering the bad. The good belongs to the phase of white magic, and its use can result only in good to the practitioner of it, whereas the black magician must reap the whirlwind of the wind that he has sown. These things come home to roost, always, friends, according to their kind, and they bring their friends home with them. In addition to the selfish and evil use above mentioned, there is another selfish use of direct telementation that is quite common of these late years. I allude to the use of mentative influence by telementation for the purpose of influencing people to fall in with the schemes and the plans and enterprises of the mentator. The principle involved is the same as in all these treatments, good and bad, and the practice is the same. The mentator forms the mental image of the other person and then floods him with currents of desire force or willpower, or both, at the same time earnestly willing and desiring that he will do as the mentator wishes him to do. The mentator usually uses his will to make the other do this in the mental picture, in imagination, thus forming a mental matrix to which he then tries to make the other conform. This is a form of visualization of which I shall speak presently. Of course, this practice, like any other of the kind, may be defeated by one asserting his individuality and will. Of course, you will not feel disposed to put into operation many of the methods herein described. Yet, from your very acquaintance with what has been mentioned in these pages, you will be enabled to see the operation of the principles in everyday life around you. You will see them in operation on every side, and now that you are familiar with their laws of operation. And you will find yourself instinctively guarding against its influence, just as you would guard against a threatened physical blow. And you will be surprised, and perhaps pained sometimes, at seeing people trying to influence you in this way, whom you would not have suspected of doing so. On the whole, you will be a much wiser and stronger man or woman by reason of the information herein given you. And you will have the advantage of knowing how to resist, defeat, and dispel the adverse influences that may be used to influence you. Remember the assertion of the positive will and the use of the positive denial. The person wishing to influence another at a distance, just as he would in the case of a personal interview, forms a mental image of the person whom he wishes to influence, and then proceeds just as if the person was actually before him. I know of at least one teacher who advises his students to treat prospective customers and others with whom they expect to have dealings or relations as follows. Imagine your prospective customer or other person as seated in a chair before which you are standing. Make the imagined picture as strong as possible, for upon this depends your success. Then proceed to treat the person just as you would if he were actually present. Concentrate your will upon him, and tell him just what you expect to tell him when you meet him. Use all of the arguments that you can think of, and at the same time hold to the thought that he must do as you say. Try to imagine him as complying with your wishes in every respect, for this imagining will tend to come true when you really meet the person. This rule may be used not only in the case of prospective customers, but also in the cases of persons whom you wish to influence in any way whatsoever. Now, all of this is very plain to the student of this book, for the principles employed are familiar to its readers. The result of a practice like this would undoubtedly tend to clear a mentative path in the other person's mind, and to make easier the effect of a subsequent interview. For the other person would be thus accustomed to the idea, thought, or feeling, and the work of clearing away the mental underbrush would be done in advance. But unfortunately for us all, fortunately for us all, we have the antidote for this bane if we have acquainted ourselves with the underlying principles of the subject. So important do I regard the subject of self-protection in connection with direct telementation that I have thought it well to add to this chapter the following general rules which I trust you will observe carefully, and with which you should fully acquaint yourself. The bane is well known. The antidote, though, is known to but few. For this reason, I attach much importance to the study of the latter at this place. In connection with the following rules and advice, you should also acquaint yourself with what I have said elsewhere regarding protection against suggestive impressions, and also with my advice regarding the cultivation of a positive mentality, and with the chapters which take up the subject of establishing a mentative center, and so on. Okay, here are the rules. Number 1, in the first place, steady your mind and calm your feeling. Then pause for a moment and say the words, I am, calmly and forcibly. I am. At the same time forming a mental picture of yourself as a center of force and power in the great ocean of mind power. See yourself as standing alone and full of power. Then mentally form a picture of your aura, extending about a yard or so on all sides of you in an egg-shaped form. See that this aura is charged with your willpower, which is flowing outward, repelling any adverse mental suggestions that are being sent to you, and causing them to fly back to the source from whence they came. A little practice will enable you to perfect this picture, which will greatly aid you in creating a strong positive aura of will, which will prove to be a dynamic armor and shield. The affirmation, I am, is the strongest known to occult science, for it is a positive statement of actual being. You may use the following affirmation also, if you please. It has helped many. Here it is. I assert my individuality as a center of force, power, and being. Nothing can adversely affect me. My mind is mine own, and I refuse admittance to unwelcome suggestions or influences. My desires are mine own, and I refuse to admit undesirable vibrations by induction or otherwise. My will is my own, and I charge it with power to beat off and repel all undesirable influences. I am surrounded by an aura of positive will, which protects me absolutely. Okay, the following denial has proved of the greatest value to many as follows. I deny to all or any the power to influence me against my best interests. I am my own master. These words may seem simple, but if you will use them, you will be surprised at their efficacy. You realize, of course, that it is the mental state aroused by the words that does the work, rather than any special virtue in the words themselves. Number 2, guard yourself from acting upon impulses. When you feel a sudden or unaccountable impulse to do this thing or that thing, stop and assert your positive individuality, and then drive out all outside influences by repeating the affirmations and so on, given above, given before, and by creating the proper mental picture. Then, when you have recovered your balance, consider the impulse and decide whether it is to your best interests or otherwise. You will be able to see this clearly by reason of your mental house cleaning that you just did a moment before. Then, if the impulse seems to be against your best interests, drive it from you, saying, I drive you away from me. You do not belong to me. Return to those who sent you, or other words to that effect. This may be rendered more forceful if you will but create a mental picture of the discarded idea flying away from you in the shape of a tiny thought wave. These mental pictures aid one very materially in such matters, both in the sending forth of an idea as well as in the discarding of one. 3. Cultivate the picture and idea of a positive aura. And always positive aura. And always think of yourself as being encased in such a one. See yourself as a strong, positive I, a center of power, encased in an impregnable sheath of auric force. You will thus be able to build up yourself into a mighty center of defense. You will be surprised at the confused manner of people who try to influence you when they come in contact with this aura, and find their suggestions and mentative currents being cast back upon themselves. Such people find themselves all broken up when they meet a condition like this, which they do not understand, for very few of them are practical occultists themselves. The mental picture of yourself as a center of power, surrounded with a positive aura, will, if persisted in, render you extremely positive, so that your influence is sure to be felt by the world with which you come in contact. You will often be amused by occurrences following after the rejection of these stray impulses and so on. You will find if you have had any impulse to buy a certain thing or sell a certain thing at a sacrifice, that in a day or so, perhaps in an hour or so, you will be approached by some person who will advise you personally to do that same thing. The person being likely to be benefited by the scheme or plan. I do not mean that such a person has necessarily tried to influence you by mentative currents, for he may not have consciously done so, but nevertheless, that is just what happened. And his desire or will has caused these currents to flow in your direction, and you have felt them. Now that your eyes have been opened to this fact, you will be amused, surprised, to see how many corroborative proofs you will receive. But always assert your individuality as a center of power, and all will be well with you in these matters. A man's mentative force is immensely more powerful when he uses it to protect his individuality than when he uses it to attack the individuality of another. In fact, if everyone understood the laws of mentative defense and would avail himself of the information given under this head, there would be almost a total absence of mentative attack, for the futility of the same would soon be recognized. The only reason that the strong individuals are able to affect the weaker ones so frequently is because the others do not know their inner power and make no defense. In fact, the majority of people do not know of these laws at all. And if anyone tells them, they sneer and smile knowingly, tapping their foreheads to indicate that their informant is just a little off. Poor sheep. They are so happy in their ignorance and conceit that it almost seems a pity to disturb them. But to return to my subject, you will find that it requires much less effort of will to protect your individuality than it does to attack the individuality of another. You will find that the law is on your side when you say, I won't be influenced. I deny the power of another to weaken my individuality. For you then have called into operation the law of nature, which is always in operation, and which she gives to her creatures in the way of an instinctive protective force. So there is no occasion to be afraid here. You are immune from attacks if you but will assert the force within you. In passing on to the other phases of telementation, I would again remind you that in these instances of direct telementation, the force may be used both consciously or unconsciously. Those who know the laws of the use of the force may propel these telementative currents direct to those whom they wish to influence, just as they may consciously give mental suggestions in a personal interview. But even where these laws are not understood, the currents or the suggestions are sent forth by the strong desire or will animating the person. Of course, the person who understands the subject will be able to direct his force with much greater precision and effect. But in any event, the effect is produced in the same way. Chapter 24 will be indirect influence.